I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. We have a great show for you tonight, including an update on Oregon's gun control law, that's Measure 114, and big news out of the tech world today. Oregon's largest private employer, Intel, getting kicked off the Dow Jones Industrial Average, being replaced by their rival NVIDIA. So for Intel, the bad last few weeks are only getting worse. We'll keep an eye out on the fallout still to come on that one. But in the meantime, let's talk about housing. It's not the typical story that you're expecting, by the way, but it is our big story tonight. A single mom in Vancouver was recently priced out of her home, and it was not because of rising rent, but something called junk fees. And no, she didn't have piles of junk sitting around the yard. But as Thomas Schultz tells us, these fees are forcing some Washingtonians to leave their homes and sometimes even the state.
In a Vancouver neighborhood full of yellow grass, one yard stands out.
This year, I actually watered it. I took the time to water it this year.
All summer long, Shawayne Hodges' garden hose has been stationed in her front yard, driving up her water bill. The reason why? Hodges says her landlord fined her $125 for yellow grass.
Yeah. They called it a non-compliance fee.
Then another $125 to tape the fee notice to her front door.
Go figure.
And that's not all. Hodges says representatives for her management company, Zenith Properties Northwest, entered her home for an inspection and took pictures of a bowl of dog food and a bed that had been slept in, then billed her for an unauthorized pet and another occupant in the house.
Within that walkthrough, I was charged $930.
Hodges says the pet food was from when her mom's dog visited, and her 22-year-old son had been staying with her. After those charges and others, Hodges owed Zenith thousands in non-compliance fees.
I am owing them now $3,200 current right now in fees. No rent, just fees.
Hodges has 3 young children and moved to Vancouver because it was cheaper than Portland. She rented this home with the help of Section 8 housing vouchers for $18.95 a month. Though at the end of 2022, Hodges says Zenith tried to raise her rent $900. The Vancouver Housing Authority rejected the increase, saying it wasn't reasonable. After the rent increase was rejected, fees began.
It's stressful.
And Hodges' attorney, Carl Snodgrass, says that's a tactic to push the single mom out of her home.
The dots line up.
Over the past few years, Snodgrass has noticed an uptick in junk fees.
But I'm concerned that this is going to be a trend that we see more and more.
Already, they've had a big impact. Days after our interview, Hodges moved to Georgia due to these fees. Zenith relisted her home for $500 more a month.
It gives me the message that we're not wanted over here.
And Andy Silver, CEO of the Vancouver Housing Authority, says these fees have the biggest impact on the most vulnerable.
You find people in a situation where they either have to move and find another place to live, or they realize they're going to fall behind.
We reached out to Zenith for an interview. They rejected our request, so said that they would answer questions via email. Though when we emailed over those questions, they instead sent us a statement saying, quote, Zenith has followed the terms of the agreement, which is compliant with Washington landlord-tenant state law. They refuse further comment.
These companies are realizing that they can get away with higher and higher fees.
If Hodges lived in Oregon or Seattle, laws and ordinances would limit these junk fees.
Yeah.
In Vancouver,
there isn't any regulation for it.
Vancouver city officials say they haven't discussed an ordinance to curb these fees because they're heavily focused on making housing more affordable.
We need to have a better understanding of the issue at this point.
And Vancouver's Economic Prosperity Director, Patrick Quinton, says even if Vancouver implements an ordinance, that won't impact tenants in other parts of Clark County.
We're hopeful that the legislature will also take up action on this.
Legislators tried last year. The Washington House of Representatives passed House Bill 2114, which would have limited fees, though the bill died in the Senate after pushback that it would lead to higher rents.
We intend to bring that bill back. We'll have a new legislature in session. It's an election year.
Nicole Macri is a Democratic state representative. She says Washington needs to address junk fees and rising rents.
We need to both protect renters and make sure that they can have access to stable, affordable housing while appreciating that costs do go up to operate housing.
Though until that happens, junk fees are becoming more common, driving more renters out of Washington.
I've never dealt with anything like this, ever.
In Vancouver, Thomas Schultz, KGW News.
And Thomas tells us that since Hodges moved out, Zenith has charged her $12,000 for repairs to the home. Her lawyer, Carl Snodgrass, there says the charges are absurdly high since there's little wear and tear on the home. Snodgrass says the home was re-rented 2 weeks ago, or 2 weeks after the family moved out. How about you? Have you ever been charged any junk fees like that? I know some of you are landlords. What's your take on these kinds of charges? Let us know, will you? Send us an email. The address is thestory@kgw.com, or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. Now to an update on Oregon Measure 114. You are not voting on that one this time around. Oregonians barely passed it back in 2022 with 50.7% of the yes vote. But the law has never actually taken effect, and it remains on hold right now thanks to a series of court challenges. This week, arguments to try and revive the law were presented to a panel of judges at the Oregon Court of Appeals. But before we get too far into those arguments, some background on what 114 would do. It states that a guns magazine cannot hold more than 10 rounds. It requires a permit to buy a gun and a safety class to get that permit. It also keeps the gun from being given to a buyer until after a background check is finished. Currently, there's no limit on the size of magazines, no permit required to purchase, and the gun can be given to a buyer after just 3 business days, even if that background check is not yet done. Now, the month after the law passed, December of 2022, 2 gun owners in Harney County out in eastern Oregon filed a suit to block it. And it worked. It's been on hold ever since. Last year, a Harney County judge ruled that the part of the law that limits how many rounds can be held in the guns magazine and that requirement to get a permit for purchase, both of those violated Oregon's Constitution, which protects the right to own guns. The state appealed that ruling, which is how the attorneys ended up standing in front of that 3-judge panel from the Oregon Court of Appeals earlier this week. Now, as I take you through some of the testimony, we're going to learn a couple of new legal terms. Won't that be fun? Something to impress your neighbors with. The first term we're going to learn is facial challenge. Now, it has nothing to do with someone's face. It's a legal term describing how a law is being challenged. Lawyers can argue that the law is unconstitutional when applied to a specific set of facts. That's called an as-applied challenge. A facial challenge is broader. It means the party is arguing the law is always unconstitutional on its face when applied to any set of specific facts. I tell you that because we're about to hear the state's lawyer argue the people who do not want Measure 114 to take effect, those people are making a facial challenge, which the U.S. Supreme Court has said is more difficult to win. Okay, one last thing. You're going to see a countdown clock on the screen here. Each lawyer gets 15 minutes to argue their case, and the judges can interrupt, by the way. The state is holding back 5 minutes for rebuttals, so they're going to start with just 10 minutes. Here we go with the lawyer from the state arguing Measure 114 is constitutional and should be allowed to take effect.
It's important to emphasize at the outset that this is a facial challenge to the constitutionality of ballot Measure 114. Plaintiffs thus bear the heavy burden to show that the law cannot be constitutionally applied in any scenario. Plaintiffs have failed to do so. That's because under the law, Oregonians remain free to use magazines with a capacity of 10 or fewer rounds. Anyone with a permit can initiate a firearm transfer, and anyone whose background check has cleared is free to complete their firearm transfer.
Oh, how about that? He's going for the knockout punch right off the top there. But the other side does get to make their argument as well, which brings us to the second legal term that we're going to learn tonight, de novo. That's a Latin phrase that means from the beginning or anew. If the Court of Appeals decides to look at this case de novo, it means they're going to examine the entire thing as if the first court never heard the case and as if the trial court never existed. Otherwise, they would be restricted to just looking at what the first court did and if that judge made any mistakes. In this next clip, we'll hear from the attorney for the gun owners. He argues this case should not be looked at de novo, that it should only be reviewed to see if there were factual errors by the judge. That would make it a lot easier to keep the Harney County judge's ruling from being overturned. Judge Christina Hellman is going to challenge him on that. Here we go.
The first is that defendants assert that this case only calls for conclusions of law. Article 1, Section 27, the constitutional provision at issue, and the Christian case, which is the test at issue, require findings of facts. For instance, whether an arm is protected or not is an inherently fact-based inquiry, as is whether a law furthers public safety and whether the law infringes or unduly burdens upon the right to keep and bear arms.
So what do you think our standard of review is?
Your standard of review, as the Muzzy case says, is where there's issues of fact, where the trial court found findings of fact. The issue is any evidence on the record. Where there are conclusions of law, especially the application of law to fact, in those instances, the review is for legal error.
What do we do with the fact that this case is seeking declaratory relief in the form of an injunction, and that if a declaratory relief action sounds in equity, we often take de novo review?
The court is not required to take de novo review. Defendants, appellants in this case, did not request it. Also, the factors from the Oregon Rules of Appellate Procedure counsel against de novo review in this instance.
So pretty fascinating, huh? All kinds of legal jargon there. But that's basically the opening round as the two sides are jockeying for position and argue how the appellate court panel should even consider the case that's before them. Can they look at it as if it's the first time it's ever been in court? Or are they restricted to just looking at what the Harney County judge did and checking to see if there's a factual error there? And is the argument that the law is unconstitutional all the time or just under certain circumstances? We don't know what the three-judge panel is thinking about on those questions, but their decision will have a huge influence on how all of this turns out. Now, a bit later in the arguments, we heard the state's lawyer explaining to the judges why Measure 114's restrictions on the size of the magazine is not unconstitutional. And believe it or not, this one requires us to travel back in time, back to the 1850s, as Oregon was approaching statehood.
In the 1850s, the capacity of a firearm was limited by its dimensionality. Because of the technology that existed at the time, the size of a firearm limited how many rounds it could fire. And the most at the time that was in common use for self-defense were pepper-box pistols and Colt revolvers, which had a capacity between 4 and 8 rounds. And in Oregon, we were at the end of the nation's supply chain at the time. The most commonly used weapon for self-defense was a single-shot flintlock rifle. Contrast that with a modern-day large-capacity magazine, which only evolved because of 3 separate technological innovations in the 1880s, 2 of them for military purposes. And as this court made clear in Oregon State Shooting Association, military developments that came out after the time of statehood don't qualify under Article 1, Section 27 because it's not personal self-defense. And to contrast the two, you look at to reload, even if you had a Colt revolver or a pepper-box pistol with 4 to 8 rounds in 1859, it would take minutes to reload because you individually had to load primer, propellant, and projectile into each barrel or chamber. To contrast that, I point this court to Las Vegas, the Route 91 Music Festival. A single shooter shot more than 1,000 rounds into a crowd of concertgoers in the span of 11 minutes. In one 60-second span, he shot 298 rounds, ultimately killing 58 and injuring more than 800. Those are very distinct technologies, and military-type weaponry, like a modern-day large-capacity magazine, does not qualify for constitutional protection.
All right, strong argument, but on the other side, the lawyer representing the gun owners argued that the requirement that they get a permit and go through a second background check alongside the federal background check that's already happened Well, that's unconstitutional because it includes everybody.
In this case, the law is not aimed at any dangerous practice.
Well,
It's not aimed at any dangerous.
isn't it, though? I mean, isn't the idea of the permit and the completion of the check, the goal is to make sure that people who shouldn't have firearms don't have them? Am I wrong on that?
So insofar as, so the legislature, or I'm sorry, the Supreme Court has put really narrow, a really narrow scope around who you're able to restrict, who the government is allowed to restrict from accessing firearms.
Right.
And those are certain people
Right.
who have been designated as dangerous, a dangerous person in this instance, so a dangerous practice or person must be regulated. And then the state does not have to carry that burden. They have not done so in this case. There's nothing in ballot measure 114 that is unique to people who have been convicted of felonies or have mental health issues or anything like that. It's aimed at all Oregonians. So for instance, a law that prohibits felons from accessing firearms, that's okay, because the legislature has designated a certain class of persons as inherently dangerous.
But isn't the purpose of the inquiry, the background check that's done to figure out who those folks are so that they're not given the permit to purchase?
Yes, so we already have background checks at the point of sale in the state of Oregon and in all 50 states in the United States. It's actually federal law that you have to go through a background check. This is a second background check. Prophylaxis upon prophylaxis. It's unnecessary. It's identical in all ways except for the FBI fingerprint background check. And so, yes, we already have background checks in the state of Oregon, and the permit to purchase, its primary aim is not a background check that's already accomplished. It's about requiring all Oregonians to go through some kind of training in order to access firearms. And there's no Supreme Court case law or other case law that gives the legislature or here the people the authority to designate all Oregonians as inherently dangerous persons unless or until they disprove that by going through some kind of training. Basically, you're presumed guilty until, or unfit until you prove otherwise to the government.
Okay, another strong argument. Now, Measure 114 continues to be on hold and probably will be even after the Court of Appeal rules. You can bet it will next go to the state Supreme Court. And at the same time, another challenge in federal court is making its way through that system. A federal judge in Portland ruled the law does not violate the U.S. Constitution, but that case also is expected eventually to make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's not the last you've heard of Measure 114. We likely have months, if not years, of litigation left before we get a final answer on this. Coming up next on The Story, Evan Watson brings us an update on Multnomah County's ambulance response times. It's a topic we've covered for years now. After the county finally relented and allowed a shift in staffing for the ambulance provider, has it made a noticeable difference? We'll find out when The Story returns. Let's talk about ambulance response times in Multnomah County. Pretty important issue, and it's been awful, by the way. But 3 months ago, the county finally agreed to let ambulance company AMR use a hybrid staffing model that the company has said would make a big difference. The latest numbers show, in fact, yeah, they're right. Evan Watson has the update.
This is incredibly encouraging data and progress.
For more than 2 years, ambulances in Multnomah County frequently arrived late to emergencies, if they were even available at all. The county and ambulance provider AMR disagreed on how to respond to a shortage of paramedics, blaming each other for the dangerous conditions. Not anymore.
It's nice to also just feel the tone and tenor change on this issue and to really focus on being good partners forward.
A compromise, reached in August, allowed AMR to staff some of its ambulances with a hybrid model of one EMT and one paramedic. And 3 months later, both sides seem content with the progress.
We've gone 90 days. We're trending in the right direction. But it's 90 days. I'm not sure what the magic number is.
Well, for us, this has actually worked a lot better than we anticipated. All the data and trends would indicate that it isn't going to be 12 months or 24 months. We're talking a matter of months, weeks.
Data shows AMR is getting closer to full contract compliance, which includes getting to 90% of emergency calls in urban areas within 8 minutes. Commissioner Sharon Myron explains that's just part of the picture.
For me, it's about saving lives, getting people to ERs faster, even if it doesn't come within the 8 minutes.
The most alarming statistic for late arriving ambulances is called level 0, the code for when there are 0 ambulances available to respond to emergency calls. 911 dispatchers forced to wait for an ambulance crew to become available and a caller left without immediate help. At the start of August, AMR Multnomah County averaged about 20 hours a week at level 0. 20 hours when someone could call 911 and have to wait. Since then, weekly level 0 numbers have decreased significantly. Last week, AMR reported just 25 minutes at level 0. A huge improvement that AMR leaders praise.
We believe this is a harbinger of great things to come with our other compliance metrics. More importantly, the citizens of Multnomah County will have the service they have come to expect from AMR over the last 3 decades.
There still are concerns. Teamsters Local 223, the union that represents AMR paramedics and EMTs, wrote a letter to the county saying newly hired EMTs are coming in with gaps and lack the quality in their training, something county health leaders acknowledge.
They were under a very tight time frame to hire a very large number of people. As they become more fully staffed, I think we'll probably see that get addressed.
County leaders say they want to meet at least quarterly moving forward to check the progress of ambulance response times. Evan Watson, KGW News.
We're just 4 days away now from Election Day, and the KGW team will be with you every step of the way. Tuesday night, we'll have hours of election coverage for you, streaming for free on KGW+. Political analysts will be on hand to break down the results as we get them. Our team of reporters will be spread out across the region, covering election night parties. Coverage starts at 7 o'clock on Tuesday night. In the meantime, that's the end of our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. But remember, the story, our collective story, that never ends. Timbers 360 is coming your way next. For those of you watching us live, enjoy your weekend. And I'll see you right back here Monday night at 6:30.